Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Thank you. So we are at the very last little section. You see the Shavi'i, the seventh aliyah of Kedoshim. And this coming week, we do have a double portion of Acharei Mot and Kedoshim. And over the years, we've worked our way through all of this. So we're coming to the very end of this, and we'll take a look at it. It's been quite a journey on these two parshiot and the two before as well. Here we go. V'lo telchu b'chukot hagoy. You shall not follow the practices of the nations or of the nation, asher ani meshalech b'fnechem, which I am casting away from before you. Ki et kol ele asu, because all these they did, va'akutz ba'am, and I was disgusted with them. So what are all these? Well, it's all the stuff that was mentioned before, basically consanguineous relationships, etc., etc. So, in fact, the verse before, right, is warning the Jewish people about guarding the hukum, the chukim, these ordinances. But look at this, so that the land does not vomit you out. So I would say that from this, I would conclude that the title that we have to the land of Israel, because that's what we're referring to, has to do with acting in accordance with the divine commandments, many of which, of course, have to do with issues of morality, of acting in moral ways, and in following the basic principle of what is hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor. And I have to leave it to you to determine how to connect those particular dots as far as that is concerned. I think I'm going to go on because I could comment a little more, but I want to make sure we take care of the Rashis. And we're so close to finishing this Sedra. And then if we have time today, I will be happy to add some other thoughts, some of which have come to me fairly recently. But akutz, he says this word akutz, lashon mius. It has the connotation of disgust or denotation of disgust. And he gives examples in Genesis chapter 27. This is where Rebecca says to Isaac after Esau marries these Canaanite women, these other women, she says, Katzti b'chayai, I'm disgusted with my life. She's so upset about it. Ka'adam, it's like a person who cuts b'mezunu, who's disgusted with his food. He finds his food disgusting. Interesting. It's quite a graphic image here. Omar lachem, and I say to you, I said to you, atem tishu et avatam, so you will inherit their land. Va'ani etnena lachem, and I will give it to you, to inherit it, to possess it. Eretz zadat chalav v'pasha, land flowing with milk and honey. Ani Hashem Elokeichem, I the Lord am your God. This is like a seal on what's being said, right? Asher yivdalti etchem, whom I have separated, etchem you min amim, from the other people. So the separation has to do, I think, legitimately, with the level of expectation that God has of us, the Jewish people, in terms of moral behavior and dedicated behavior. And this is coming out here at the end of Parshat Kedoshim. Here we go. We don't have a Rashi. V'hivdaltem ben habamei haTorah. So this goes into this. And you shall separate, right, between the pure animals, the tum'ah, from the impure, uvein ha'of hatamei, the tahor, and between the birds that are impure, the tahor, from those that are pure. And you shall not make your cells discussed it. Through the animals, Uvaoth, and the birds, Uvachol Asher Tirmos Adama, and everything with which the earth crawls, Asher Hivdalti Lachem Latameh, which I have separated off from you as impure. So what we put in our bodies is something quite considerable. After all, whatever we put into our bodies as food, eventually becomes a good part of it, becomes who we are, becomes part of our physical bodies. But the sense that food also may have emotional or psychological effects on us, etc., etc. But regardless, it is, we'll see. There's actually a lovely Rashi here a little bit later on about this. Here we are. You've dunked in, and you shall separate yourselves Torah, between the cattle which are pure. This is a quotation, right, of the verse. It's may from those that are impure. Ein sarich lomar ben para lechamor. He doesn't have to say what is. In other words, what he's saying is he doesn't mean here when he says pure and impure between a cow and a donkey. Okay, I mean that's not what he's talking about. Shahare Muvdalin, because they clearly, I mean, you don't have to be careful about that, right? You know, cows are essentially can be tahor, and no donkey, you can't do anything to a donkey to make it pure. It's by definition impure. So he's saying that's not what the Torah is referring to here. So the Nikarim, they're they're recognizable. Elabain Torah lacha, but in the sense of what is pure to you, the tum'ah lacha, from that which is impure to you. And he gives an example to clarify. Vein shem nishkat rovo shel siman. In other words, when it comes to preparing the animal to be consumed, right, it goes through shchita. It has to be nishkat. It has to be slaughtered in a particular kind of way. And whether the majority of the siman, so it's called a siman, which means a sign, but it has to do with it has to do with the esophagus and the trachea, which have there's an area in there that has to be cut properly, okay, and where on that organ it is cut. So whether the majority has been cut, the incision, the nishchat chetzio, or whether only half of it's been cut. In other words, whether that slaughter, that shchita, has taken place properly. Because if it isn't slaughtered properly, it is tameh. It is not tahor. It has to be done properly. The kama ben rovo lechetzio, and he says, and how much is the difference between the majority to half of it? We're talking about a hair's breadth. In other words, that we should take great care in terms of determining whether this animal is pure or impure. And again, this lends itself to some thinking and some meditation about the significance of this particular interpretation. Because we have to remember when you're taking a live creature and consuming it, and the idea that this has to be done in a very respectful way, and that essentially there's this awareness again that we own nothing, that we do these things, essentially the ability for us to take the life of an animal and then consume parts of that animal is something that we have only because God has given us permission to do that and shown us the way in which we can do this in a permissible kind of way. So it's basically here we're seeing this is what's involved in having a life of kedusha, holiness. Asher hivdati lachem letameh, which I have separated for you in order to render impure. And letameh means leasor. Let's be clear about it. Rashi says it means to prohibit. Going on. Go back, I believe, to here. Yeah, right. 1 second. Did I get all of this done? I just want to make sure. Here we are. Right, we did this. Okay, we're here. V'hitem li kedoshim, and you shall be to me sanctified. You shall sanctify yourselves to me. Ki kadosh ani Hashem, for I, the Lord, I Hashem, am sanctified. V'avdil etchem min ha'amim, and I have separated you from the nations, liyot li, to be mine, to be for me. Rashi. I've separated you, min ha'amim, from the peoples to be mine. Im atem muvdalim, if in fact, so it's connected. This separating, being willing to take on practices that are not done by other nations or other people because God has commanded them. And that's the reason. Im atem muvdalim mehem, if you separate yourselves in terms of their practices from them, are atem shali, you will be mine. Ve'im lav, however, if you don't, are atem shel Nebuchadnezzar v'chaverav, then you will be that of Nebuchadnezzar and his associates. And this, I love the next little section that we're going to say. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, he's a Amora that I actually like the stuff he comes up with to a great extent as I come across it. Omer, he says, Miyain shelo yomar adam, where do we get the idea that a person shouldn't say, nafshi katsa b'basar chazir? A person shouldn't say, oh, I hate, I'm disgusted by pig meat. Person shouldn't say that. Why? Why do we know? Or you shouldn't say bush kilayim. Or I can't tolerate wearing we're talking about garments here of a mixture of wool and flax. I can't stand the feel of on my body. It's something that disgusts. I shouldn't say that. Aval yomar, that a person should, and I think he's saying necessarily shouldn't say, but he shouldn't think. Ifshi, right? I could. I could. I could eat pork. I actually like it. I think it tastes great. I love bacon, right? I could. But what can I do? As much as I'd love to do that, as much as I'd love to eat kilayim, as much as I'd love to eat pork, but my Father in heaven, Gazar alai, has made an edict on me. So how do we know this? That's the attitude we should have. Not that these things are horrible, but more the fact that we are under command of our divine creator. Talmud Omar. And for this reason, scripture says, Va'avdil etchem, I separate you, min ha'amim. I'm the one who separates you from the people, liyot li, to be for me. So it's not because you yourselves feel a need to be separated, but because you have such respect for me. Shetahiyu davachem mikem lishmi, that you mehem, yudaltachem mehem lishmi, that you're separating yourselves from them is for my sake. Poresh min ha'avera, you should separate yourselves from transgression, umakabel alav ol malchut shamayim, and to accept upon yourself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. So, going on. The ish or isha, ki yevahem ov or yidoni. And as for a man or a woman who practices or believes in a ghost or a familiar spirit, right? We're talking essentially about necromancy. Mot yumatu, they shall be put to death. In other words, it's a capital offense. It's interesting because I think part of what motivates people to engage in this kind of stuff is perhaps the fear of mortality. That, of course, we face our mortality. But if we really have a trust in God, we don't have to be afraid of it. And in fact, I really do believe, although, of course, many scholars would disagree with me, that the Torah, in fact, does believe in immortality, and that, in fact, I very much believe that so many of the practices involving tum'ah and taharah, exactly, which is the subject, as you can see, that we've been dealing with in this chapter, actually are ways in which to ensure immortality, right? They shall be, well, this needs explanation, and it will get explained, right? But this is a capital offense. Evan, whether stoned, Yirgamu otam, they shall be stoned, to mehem bam, their blood is on their heads. And we'll see. There's Rashi on this, and it doesn't take away the entire pain of it, but at least it explains it very importantly, right? All those words are significant. Kiebahem of, right? If they are practicing, right, belief in a ghost or familiar spirit, kan ne'emar bahem mita, right? He points out this is not the first time that the Torah is making a reference to this kind of practice. He says here, it says capital punishment. Ulamala karet, but above, when it talks about it, it talks about karet, which is a divine punishment. It's not a human, not administered by a court. So here we go. So how do you make the distinction? And this is a very, very important principle that you're going to learn in a moment. Edim v'hatra'ah, if there are witnesses that this person did it, v'hatra'ah means forewarning. So then it says piskila, right? Then the man is stoned. In other words, the person has to be warned ahead of time that such practice is a capital offense, and the person has to say in front of these witnesses, I know it, and I still plan on doing it. I'm fully aware that what I'm doing is a capital offense, but I still plan to do it regardless. Right? And there are witnesses who see him then do it, then the punishment is stoning. Mezid, right? If he does it intentionally, right? Below hatra'ah, but it was without any forewarning. He knows it's wrong. He does it. He wasn't warned. There was no statement. There was no sort of Jewish Miranda involved here. Okay? Well, that ikaret, or right? So this is the punishment where karet is this divine punishment is administered. Uveshigigatam, right? And if it's done unintentionally, in other words, he's not aware, okay, that it could be out of ignorance of the law, or it could be for some other reason that he forgot. I know it sounds unlikely, but in this particular case, maybe he didn't realize that such a practice was in fact necromancy, didn't know, didn't understand. It's unintentional, right? It's not accidental, but it's unintentional. Then it's chatat. He has the option, or he has the ability to gain atonement, complete atonement, by bringing a sin offering. V'chein, and now Rashi says this is a general principle. V'chein b'chol chayvei mitot. Right. This has to do with every capital offense. Right. Any offense where one would have to pay the death penalty. Shineamar bahem karet, where it says karet. You can extrapolate from this the general principle that if it talks about karet in regarding an offense, right, it means this situation, these three possibilities, right? Hatra'ah and witnesses, forewarning and witnesses, intentional, knowing that it's wrong, doing it, and unintentional, these various situations. And with this, we conclude the Sedra of Kedoshim. And I'm going to stop the share and ask if any of you have any thoughts or comments. So, over to you. No comments? Please don't do that.
Well,
Yes, thank you.
I just don't like religious law, like the lack of separation of church and state and the strictness of, and I know because I've heard this excuse a lot that the death penalty was rarely done, and it was done relatively humanely, and all, I remember all of that. But I still don't like the death penalty ever for anything, and certainly not for a religious violation when you have a, nice, helpful person in the world, for instance, and you're getting rid of that because, he, uh, what does it say here? Divined, and or she, and I just don't like it, and
Well,
I know the answers.
well, maybe you're giving me that opportunity, or maybe
Sure,
I can share. Okay, I understand. I do. I have no problem with with your sentiments and with your thoughts about it. The death penalty is a severe one. I can only try and contextualize it. For one, on in terms of how I can find it helpful. In other words, I'm going to try and look and try to understand it from the Torah's point of view. That doesn't necessarily ultimately come to be mine, it might, but at least it opens a gateway for me. And that is to take a what I would call, perhaps inaccurately, a phenomenological approach to this, which is again, like social work. You want to meet your client where they're at, and the client here is the Torah. And so I want to try and meet the client and understand the client where it's at. And part of it has to do with the nature of your belief in a divine creator. So a lot of it has to do, a lot of our attitude comes to where does life come from to begin with? Now, that's only helpful to a certain point and may not be helpful at all, but at least I'm saying that that helps me understand where they're coming from, where the Torah is coming from. Where I find it helpful in terms of my own personal religious journey is that it's informing me on what's inappropriate. Now, I am going to say this, that trying to apply religious law with only the Torah and without the full value of our oral tradition is a mistake. That's where mistakes come. I can tell you that, for example, when you read later on in the book of Numbers about the sotah, that is the woman suspected of adultery, and then you read even the Mishnah of sotah, because there's a tractate that deals with it, you come away with a very different kind of sense of what the Torah ultimately is trying to say. The Torah, in some way, I mean, it's a skeleton, right? It's a framework. And really, to be able to apply that framework, you have to understand the various principles of the oral Torah. And I love the idea of saying that the Torah as we have it, as we're studying it in the Pshat, right? Just simply the words of the Torah, that's up in heaven. But in order to bring the Torah down to earth and to try and actually apply it, is you need the oral Torah. The oral Torah is the medium by which you actually apply the written Torah. And that is because the generating principle of the oral Torah is circumstances alter cases. And that takes into account some of the sentiments you're expressing, Lauren, and the ability to withhold judgment about the Torah. And part of what is really brilliant about it, about which I obviously that's where I'm at now, is this idea of not just being something in principle, but something that we actually try to make in practice. So since I have a few minutes, I will try and tell you what I was referring to earlier on in this session. I have come to the conclusion that, in fact, the Torah understands each and every single one of us to be a model of the temple. Every human being is a model of the temple. And what was the idea of the temple? The temple was an idea of being,
Excuse me, every Jewish human being or every human being?
I would say that every person who practices Judaism, okay, but and since anybody can become Jewish, right? You can, and by the way, the Torah is very clear that it has not so much to do with identity as it has to do with character, okay? And I'm not one who feels that Judaism is the only legitimate religion. I actually think that there are other ways in which God gives people the ability to do this. But right now, I'm talking about my family. So no judgments outside of it, talking about the family. So just for the sake of understanding, right? Every one of us is a temple. And the purpose of the temple is to connect the world to its divine source, to be able to feel the influence of that divine source in the world. Now, what I will say to back up my point about being any human being is that the Torah doesn't say the Jewish people were created in the divine image. It says every human being is created in the divine image. And something that I've realized, okay, which is going to connect these ideas, is that when it says that every human being is created in the divine image, it is exactly the same as saying that every person has the potential of being a temple, meaning that every human being has that ability to bring the divine into this world, to connect the divine to this world by their practices and their behaviors and the level of life, the way in which they choose to conduct their lives. And this also answers another question for me because it also gives significance to every individual's life. And part of the reason for these reasons of kashrut and stuff like that is because the temple is a sacred place and it needs to be treated in a way that makes sure it is sacred. We can defile ourselves or we can sanctify ourselves. But the idea ultimately is to make this place a place in which the divine can be part of what goes on in the world. And that is the meaning of the fact that we are created in the divine image. That God has given human beings that potential and maybe that responsibility. And that's my understanding. And I'm losing people, so I don't know if it's a message that is unwelcome. I'll stop while I'm behind. Mead, you're off
Yeah,
mute. Go for it.
no, I jumped in the middle of this. We're a little disorganized here in the house today, so no, I just caught the end of Kedoshim. I've just got to go through the Parsha with my modern biblical history
No problem.
perspective, and then I may have more to say down the road.
Okay.
But for the moment, it was just interesting hearing the last few minutes of what you had to say. That's all.
Okay. Cool.
All right.
Well, read
David,
ahead so you can say during the Parsha.
Well, we finished Kedoshim, so are we going
Yep.
on to Torah Tamima
we
tomorrow?
are indeed tomorrow. Our next
And
lesson
I
will
was
be,
just curious. I mean,
yes.
we did I miss Acharei at some point along the line?
No, no. It has been done. We have completed it.
Okay, so
I look to see. You can
rather
look.
than go into Torah Tamima immediately, you went uh, to Kedoshim. Because
Correct. Because a double portion. For
well,
this,
last week was a double portion.
correct. And this week's a double portion too.
And this is also a double portion. Oh, okay.
Yes.
I didn't realize this is
Yeah.
another double portion
There's
coming.
another double portion.
Got
Kedoshim.
All right. Well,
Yes.
now that I have my calendar straight, I'll get a
Well,
little.
you can't do anything without a straight calendar.
Okay. Very good. All
Well,
right.
during Passover, there may have been additionals as
Why
well.
don't I stop the recording? Because this is not
Yeah.
necessarily needed to be
Yeah.
recorded. So I'm going to stop the recording. All right.